Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. Paul, well, it looks like China is cracking down and expanding the energy and critical resource war. Paul, as always, I want to thank you for being a part of this discussion. And it looks like there's some new information out that China is getting ready to put more pressure on the U.S. to try to actually work as a partner.
Yeah, well, firstly, thanks for joining me as well today. It's always a pleasure. Well, yeah, this is extremely important because basically they're escalating this energy and critical resource war at the United States specifically. Uh, no, they're not doing it for any other reason. They're turning the screw on the US to make things extremely difficult for them because they know the United States has been running all around the world trying to secure resources from Greenland or threatening to. They're trying to cook up some deal with the Ukrainians, is another example. I mean, and also we'll come on to the end about what they're trying to do domestically inside the United States. And China's fully aware of this. And that's why they've now come out with this policy where they're going to add to its strategic reserves of key industrial metals through the course of 2025. This will obviously boost the resilience of critical mineral supply when we're obviously going through this huge energy transition demand globally, and also because of the issues with the United States, who decided to have a tariff war with China. And of course, China's response is going to be very targeted, very calculated. And one of them is, well, if the US is desperately trying to shore up its critical minerals, not only have we, like as they already did in 2024, stopped shipping the likes of gallium and germanium to the United States, well, China in the process is going, well, we're going to now start buying up more and more metals on the global markets. Now, it's worth recalling, we've said this before, but it's extremely important. When Xi went on a global tour of the global South countries and appeared at mining operations, everyone thought, why is he doing this? This is ridiculous. Well, so China has increasingly a stake in miners all over the world and buys these resources directly as part of a deal of financing these operations. And this will include the likes of cobalt, nickel, lithium, copper. I mean, and essentially what this revolves around is there's an institution called the National Food and Strategic Reserves Administration that manages China's official commodity stockpiles. And also there is the National Development and Reform Commission, who obviously oversees all this. They're part of this planning body that looks at excuse me, stockpiles. And what it's done is said in annual reports it writes that goes to the Chinese government that the country should and will move significantly quicker to fulfill their stockpiling of strategic minerals, metals, post haste. So what they're planning to do is front run this and do it a lot faster. So maybe look to buy up the entire year's reserves within a matter of months. And they're quite capable of doing this. Now, of course, when they do this, this could send sort of shockwaves through commodities markets, principally in the West, where all of a sudden there's going to be shortages all over the place. And also in China, there is the State Reserve Bureau that obviously manages inventories of everything, including not just metals, but also food commodities and obviously energy. And obviously it assesses what would then purchasing these metals, etc., and energy, and obviously food items on the market prices. Now, what we can say for sure is that agency's been increasing, and I know this, stocks in metals like cobalt, silver. They've also replaced old copper inventories with new ones. This is not a recent phenomenon. They've been doing this for a while. The big difference is China's accelerating this enormously, and it knows it's going to have a huge impact on the United States, who, as I said, is telegraphed. We have a problem and concerns with accessing such resources. Now, China's major move usually, and I don't doubt this is any different this time, is to meet demand. And they will have huge demand when they think there's going to be a lack of access to it in the markets in the future. I mean, obviously, if you stockpile any commodity, you can balance supplies, you can stabilize prices. I mean, the only thing I would say is China doesn't reveal very much about its stockpiling plans. You're never going to find out quantities, when they're going to do it, because, surprise, surprise, it's a matter of national security. The other thing I think that's worth noting in China is they're going to build out huge storage facilities for everything, including grain, meat, sugar, fertilizers. They're also building even more storage facilities for oil, storage warehouses. They want to manage the reserves far more effectively, even though they're pretty efficient at doing it. And this is a signal that they are envisaging some sort of supply problems in the coming year. They're also signaling that they want to ensure they have as much access, or not just access, but storage facilities, and therefore the quantities they want to buy of all these various commodities. I think the other thing, of course, is China has been diversifying commodity suppliers. This is part of Xi's charm offensive going around the world. That minimizes risk. I mean, and because they're concerned about all the global trade problems triggered, of course, by Trump's tariff policies and all the volatility. And this, in part, is why we've seen metals rising in terms of gold and silver in the US. We're not here to discuss that. But what's very telling, if you look at the price of copper, that obviously, in terms of the pricing on New York COMEX, I think nearly hit a record high. I mean, and this is due to Trump tariffs, because he ordered the US Commerce Department to look at imports of copper. And we presumably with a view to putting tariffs on that, along with aluminium and other commodities. So prices are moving as a result of that. So China's looking at this going, well, this could cause price spikes. And therefore, on that basis, we need to be aware of the risks that Trump's tariff policies could implement. There's no doubt also that in African countries, they've stopped supplying things like cobalt in from Congo, which is the world's largest producer. They put this export moratorium in. And this is also causing problems in terms of access to commodities. But principally, this is a reaction to US policy. And China knows as a result of this, it's going to cause huge problems, because if the United States suddenly has to pay an awful lot more just for a commodity, and then you slap the tariff on top, they know this is going to cause immense damage to the US. So this is targeted at the US. They'll claim it isn't, but they're saying, right, if you're going to play games with tariffs, we're going to hit you where we know it's going to hurt you. And this is another example of that.
Yeah, and China is already ahead of the game. I think it was during the pandemic when, the global economy just came to a standstill. They were buying steel, copper, aluminum, et cetera, on the cheap and just stockpiling it immensely. And then coming out of that pandemic, 2022, 2021 area, you could see how their economy, jumped to 5%, 6%, almost immediately out of there, because they had the resources and they were already in the capacity to go ahead and do some infrastructure as well as other industrial evolutions. And you see the West really hasn't come out of the pandemic when it comes to really their economy. And now all of a sudden, Trump and even Europe are suddenly talking about, okay, we need to go ahead and boost this up and re-engineer industry, whatever. China is already well ahead of the curve over the past 3 years. And in the meantime, they've been, as you mentioned, been looking at the more the multipolar world, Africa, the BRICS countries, and because both Europe and the U.S. have put so many sanctions and just willy-nilly put restrictions on uh, different industries, different capacities, et cetera, they're already behind the power curve, trying to find this. And take a look at what Canada. Canada is one of the biggest import or exporters to the United States, and in just a short period of time, President Trump has already vilified Canada to the point that they're shifting over to Europe. So can the U.S. rely upon Canada for its resources like it's done over the past decades? And is that going to go to Europe? Meanwhile, China has been cultivating relationships and helping build things on different continents so they have multiple supply chains and much more access to things that they're not bound by the sanctions and restrictions that the West has imposed on just about everybody in the world. And that includes Russia, et cetera.
Yeah, exactly. Another issue, and this shows what China's thinking. They haven't been importing LNG from the United States now for about 6 weeks. I mean, and what this means is all those selling this LNG are trying to then find somewhere else to ship the LNG to avoid the tariffs that Beijing's imposed on this US LNG. Now, obviously, currently, there aren't any US shipments en route to China. And this trade war, of course, comes about because what China did was imposed a 15% tariff on US LNG shipments. This started probably about 6 weeks ago. And that was because the US put all these blanket tariffs on Chinese exports. Now, what happened as well is, in response to this, Chinese gas buyers with long-term commitments to US projects, what they're actually doing is reselling those shipments to Europe. I mean, so that this is their retaliation. Companies in China are now also don't want to sign deals with US facilities. And what are they doing? They want to procure more supplies from the Middle East, from Asia Pacific, from Russia. That's their reaction to this. They'll play a game and say, okay, we'll retaliate by putting tariffs on US LNG, and then they'll just find a way to stop importing US LNG, who then has to find another market, which is extremely difficult. It's hugely problematical, and they're turning the screw on US energy companies. And then, because in the end, if you put massive pressure on businesses, they're going to respond. Eventually, they're going to get really angry and then turn their wrath on the Trump administration. And what's also worth noting is, I mean, we know in recent years, China and Australia have had pretty checkered relations. It's improved a lot recently. And basically, China's recently made a agreement to buy LNG from Australia for a period of 15 years. That's the first supply deal between Australian and Chinese companies since I can't remember. And that's part of this improvement in relations between the two countries. So, where the United States energy companies lose out, the Australians are going fine. And this is great business for us. Of course, the other thing China continues to do is produce more gas domestically. I mean, and output's been rising. And if you look for year on year for the first 2 months of 2025, that increased 4% year on year. I mean, and of course, they have the cheaper alternatives than the United States anyway, including gas piped from Russia, as you know, through the Power of Siberia 1 line. And of course, they get access to coal and also renewables from Russia. So this is one of these huge problems. And Trump should have learned this, because when they last had the trade war under Trump presidency 1.0, what did China do? They stopped US LNG imports, and they only resumed them once Trump was no longer in office and the Biden administration got into power. And of course, what really didn't help was when Rubio came out and said, we should use LNG as leverage in trade negotiations, meaning China. So what was China's response? Forget it. We're not going to start messing around with you thinking you're going to throw your weight around with LNG. We're just going to cancel these orders. We're going to find alternative suppliers. I mean, and this is going to cause huge problems for US energy companies, and also in terms of these companies wanting to secure long-term contracts, which they hope they could do with the Chinese, to finance new exploration opportunities. So this, again, is a massive problem that Trump's caused. No one's thought this through remotely. And frankly, you'd think you'd learnt your lesson the first time around, but no, let's repeat the same nonsense and expected a different result. Well, China's done precisely what it did the first time around, and it's done it again. And this time it's making it more permanent by finding alternatives like the deal signed with Australia.
Yeah, and it's already having a major effect on the U.S. You won't hear it coming out of the Trump administration, but while one of Trump's big things was to be independently sustainable, that includes having to rely upon getting sourcing your own minerals. And as we saw what's going on with in Alaska over the last couple of days, they've opened up 20 million acres of new development. That's great, but the reality is how long is it going to take to actually start the development? And two, what's going to be the cost? Because if they're, been relying upon cheap steel, cheap aluminum, and cheap imports to sustain the economy going forward, if they now have to suddenly invest in their own infrastructure development, and it's kind of funny because didn't we have a $1.5 trillion investment act under the Biden administration, where in the last 3 years, absolutely nothing has been built. So you're talking something that's going to take 5 to 10 years to come to fruition. What are you going to do in the meantime while you're driving away all of your other customers where you were able to get cheap goods and cheap resources, and you're also driving away their desire to use the dollar in any type of transactions?
Yeah, absolutely. Just a quick point, well, a couple of points on what you're saying to support that view. As some people know, I know the mining sector extremely well. I understand the huge challenges you face, and people need to be aware of the fact you can't just go and start drilling holes in the ground somewhere and find resources. You first have to find somewhere where you think there's resources. Then you need to do exploration work, which can be very expensive, depending on if they're lying at very significant depth. Some it can be on the surface, a lot of it isn't. Then you have to make sure you can find or build up a resource base that would justify it to be commercially viable. Then you have to go through a process then of doing feasibility studies and bankable feasibility studies, and then find someone who's prepared to finance this. Then you have to find someone to buy the resources, and then, as you say, Ken, put in the infrastructure, because the United States is a vast country, but large parts of it don't have any infrastructure. You can't just truck things out to 500, 1,000, 1,500 miles to somewhere else. It's just not reality. So there are enormous challenges. And realistically, you want to proven up a resource that is commercially viable and is going to last more than a few years. You want something that's long term. The odds of doing that are not great. And also, even if you do, with all the infrastructure required, which is going to cost trillions of dollars all over the US, who's going to finance that? You could be talking minimum 10 years. You could be talking 15, 20 years. People can cut corners with permits, and I would agree that the permitting process in the US is idiotic, and that's being polite. I've had experience of that too. But the issue is that you can cut certain corners, but at the end of the day, you have to find viable mineral deposits. And there's a lot of claims that there are deposits in the US in certain places, and well, go and find them and prove them up, and then start costing up, because to build mines could cost billions. I mean, we're talking a 5-10 billion minimum. Not for open cast mine, that's a very different thing. But these are not cheap operations, and they're fraught with risk, and people can spend huge amounts of money and then operations fail. So this is far from given. People seem to be under the impression, because Trump goes, well, here's an executive order, we can go mine this. That, it's like a supermarket shelf. All these resources are just lying there. Well, you've got to go in, open the shop up, go and buy it, and there you go. Well, no, absolutely not. There's enormous amounts of work to be done. And also, who's going to finance this? Because, if you risk spending huge sums of money with no return, I mean, you could easily spend 30, 50, 100 million to find that it's not economically viable. Well, that's a big risk. Who's going to take that risk? So, again, huge problems. The US should have stuck to what it was getting and then started to go, okay, let's have a development program internally. Let's be sensible about this and see if we can prove up some of the resources. But make sure you can produce those resources commercially, that are commercially viable in sufficient quantities, to then you can phase out imports from the likes of China. But just acting in this way with no clear plan, no actual implementation process for a very long time, frankly, for me, is foolish.
I think one final thing to add is the fact it's not just China putting restrictions on resources, energy purchases, etc., but it's also we're starting to see the brain drain come out of the United States. Uh, Chinese and Indian doctors and PhDs and that who came over and had built pretty much the Silicon Valley that we have today, they are starting to go back home. And so if you take a look at who's going to be able to do the development, the infrastructure, the engineering for this, there's really not a lot of Native American people coming out of university today who are capable of doing that type of vast innovation and expansion. Obviously, we have the Elon Musks, but take a look at what the United States, the last real thing that they built, probably the 1970s, the Great Alaskan Pipeline. That's the last real thing I can think of sustain, of marvel and engineering that they built. Where China has built the Three Gorges Dam, they're putting bridges over places that many of would have thought impossible. You're seeing the industrialized and the beauty of their cities, while everything in the United States is just falling apart in degradation. Well, if the entire infrastructure is falling, if you don't have an education system that's churning out the engineers and the innovators of the future, how in the hell are you going to be able to do some of the major developments that you want to do, especially if the foreigners, the H-1B people who you had brought over to sustain you over the past 10, 20 years, they're all going back to their own countries because that's where the action is.
You know what, Ken? That's an immensely important point. One thing I would add, when you said Native Americans, Ken means American-born citizens, not Native Americans, as most people would interpret that to be.
Yeah, that's why I said Native
yeah,
American people.
But I thought I would add that in case someone
Yeah.
complains. Ken doesn't mean that in any way, shape, or form. But no, your point about the brain drain, and we're seeing some very high highly significant Chinese, well, maybe Chinese Americans, I don't know the background, but they're all going back to China in droves. This is a huge problem for the United States. So, yeah, an extremely important point to make as well.
Very good. Any final thoughts? Or I
No, I
think
think
we
that's
covered
fine.
quite a bit. Paul, as always, thank you very much for your insight and for being a part of this discussion.
Yeah, and likewise.
And to everybody here at the Sirius Report community, thank you for all of your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think it might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.